Hello and welcome to our third and final video on the First World War. Today we're looking at why Germany lost that war. And this is, I think, my favourite part of the course, because you're seeing how some of those ideas that have been set up and building over the 4 years, how they all culminate in an Allied victory and a defeat for the Germans. So, we're looking at Unit 3. If you haven't already, then please make sure you've watched Unit 1 and 2 and those videos to help you to understand the broad picture. And what we got up to at that point was we looked at some key battles, and we looked at the point where Germany, things are starting to turn for Germany. There are tactics like the tank and the use of the tank and creeping barrage, which are developing, and things are starting to look pretty tricky for the Central Powers, particularly Germany. So, Germany's position in 1917 into 1918, it starts with a real boost for the Germans. You've got a picture of Lenin on the right-hand side there, and after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, when the communists take charge and remove Tsar Nicholas from power, Russia decides to withdraw from the war. They signed something called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on the 3rd of March 1918. As a result, they have to give up huge amounts of land to the Germans, and most importantly for Germany are now able to close the Eastern Front. They can transfer nearly 1 million troops to the Western Front to really focus on defeating Britain and France. Or is it just Britain and France? Because after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, USA had been preparing to join the war. And in 1917, there were two events that finally dragged them in. One of them was Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which Germany had stopped after the sinking of the Lusitania, but resumed in 1917. That was the key for them to go, well, the Lusitania could happen again. Obviously, in that event, 128 Americans were killed, so that was one of the sparks that led America to commit and join. The other was an intercepted document called the Zimmermann Telegram, where it was found that Germany were promising American land to Mexico if they were successful in the war. And that was the first time that America went, actually, this war is getting very close to our shores. This is not just a European problem. We can't remain isolationist. Instead, we have to join the war. But as we go into 1918, Germany believes they have this small window of opportunity to win the war, to use those extra troops from the Eastern Front, and to get in there and finish the war before the American numbers start to overwhelm them. What is really a huge difficulty for Germany as the war develops is the naval blockade. And we talked in our last video about how the Battle of Jutland was the only major sea battle, and even though the Germans ended up killing more British sailors and destroying more British ships, after the naval blockade and after the Battle of Jutland, Germany is no longer able to function as a force and remains in its ports for the rest of the war. Because of that, then Britain and the Allies are able to stop supplies from getting into Germany, and it starts to have a devastating effect by 1918. In 1918, 300,000 civilians, so non-army personnel, had died from malnutrition, from not having the right diet. In the winter of 1917, that became known as the turnip winter, because Germans were told to use this vegetable, this hardy vegetable, the turnip, which was able to be easily grown in Germany, to live off that, and pretty much only that, because of food shortages. There are also reports of Germans having to eat war bread, both soldiers and civilians, bread which is made of half flour and half sawdust and even soil used to replace it, because they didn't have enough flour to make the amount of bread needed. Now, this not only damaged German morale for both civilians at home and for the army, but it also gave them a huge disadvantage, where Germans at this point are exhausted, hungry and tired after 4 years of fighting, and they're now coming up against Americans who are just about to join the war. They are fresh, they are well fed, they are well equipped. There is all of a sudden a huge imbalance in the sides. But as we said, Germany feels like it's got this small window, so it launches its last gasp attempt. So our handsome fella on the right, General Ludendorff, he launches the spring offensive in spring 1918. Ludendorff used different tactics than he had done for the rest of the war in order to try and break through the stalemate and end this war quickly. The key thing that he uses is small groups of well-equipped soldiers called storm troops. and they were able to punch through the lines of trenches rather than whole huge armies and battalions trying to travel through. Instead, these small numbers of stormtroops are able to punch through lines quickly. And this tactic had real success early on. They were able to push back the Allies. However, in the process of the spring offensive, they lost 400,000 men, and they had no reserve soldiers left to replace them because of the harsh impact of the preceding 4 years. German attacks were also held up because starving troops who had not been able to get lots of food were stopping at the villages or the trenches that they go past in order to get more food. And that shows the devastating impact of the naval blockade, that that the soldiers are just desperate to get some food into them, even though they know they need to keep pushing on. And by May 1918, in the middle of this spring offensive, there were nearly 1 million American soldiers in Europe, and 10,000 more were arriving every single day. And at this point, the last gamble has failed. The Allies had put Marshal Foch, the Frenchman, in charge of their united forces, so they combined their forces together, a very smart move at this point. And the 100-day offensive, called that because it's the last 100 days before the end of the war, it saw the Allies respond to the spring offensive and burst through. They pushed the Germans back and they burst through this heavily fortified Hindenburg line in September of 1918. The next month, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire surrender. They are the Germans' sort of last surviving allies. And Ludendorff, who created the spring offensive, contacted the Kaiser and told him that defeat was inevitable and they had no choice but to ask for an armistice. As we get into November, Germany is still hanging on, and then on the 4th of November, the German High Seas Fleet, so part of the Navy, they refused to follow orders to attack the British Navy because it was seen as a suicidal attack, but also they are starving to death at this point. They are exhausted, they are tired. They know from rumours spreading across Europe that this war is unwinnable for Germany. And so they refuse orders, and that event is known as the Kiel Mutiny, and it is the culmination of the naval blockade. It is a brilliant event to remember because it shows you that the naval blockade eventually causes people to turn against the Kaiser and his decisions. So the Kiel Mutiny doesn't just stop as a group of men refusing to follow their orders in the Navy. Though that revolution spreads across the country and people start to protest and demand that the war must be over now, that Germany needs to surrender. 5 days later, the Kaiser, whose big idea this had been, who loved Germany so much, was a keen nationalist, militarist, imperialist, it's all over for him. He abdicates and he flees to Holland. And then at 11 a.m, and we'll know this by now, at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, the armistice was signed in Marshal Foch's train carriage, ending the war. And if you know anything about World War II, you'll know that that train carriage becomes very famous because Hitler is so badly affected by the armistice, so upset by Germany surrendering in World War I, that when he then retakes France, when he forces France to surrender during World War II, he makes sure the papers are signed in that very same train carriage. So, that is the end of our course, and these are a couple of things that you could practice in order to help you. Okay, so our first one, write an account. We've talked about practicing this one before. This is your question 3, that should say, rather than 1 of the paper. Write an account of how the failure of the spring offensive led to Germany's defeat. 2 options for write an account, either cross out write an account of and write explain and treat it as 2 Peel paragraphs, point, evidence, explain, and link back to the question. So that is one way of doing it, or tell it as a historical account. What happened in the spring offensive? And then what were the consequences of that? Because of the spring offensive, tell me how it led on to the 100-day offensive. Tell me how it was the last gasp attempt, which meant that Germany was left with no choice but to surrender. And then finally, and this is a brilliant opportunity, I think, for your domino effect to come in, the naval blockade was the main reason Germany lost the First World War. How far do you agree? And with this topic, in the main, and there are sometimes exceptions which we need to prepare for, as we have done with our Unit 2 question, in the main they will usually ask you, why did World War One start in the essay question, or they'll ask you, why did it end? And I think it would be a great revision to prepare what your essay would look like for either of those eventualities. So this one is blaming the naval blockade as the main reason that Germany lost. And think about the knock-on effect of that. If you agree with it, you could say, I agree with that, I think that is the case because it caused the Kiel Mutiny, it caused Germany to be starving, which meant that they couldn't compete with the Americans. You could even link the naval blockade and that war at sea with the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, bringing America into the First World War. Or you could completely disagree. We've seen some fantastic answers where people have said the main reason goes all the way back to the Schlieffen Plan and that failure in 1914, because the naval blockade is in the main executed and done by Britain. Britain don't join the war until the failure of the Schlieffen Plan because of the Treaty of London that brings them in to protect Belgium. It is completely up to you how you decide to answer this, but remember those very top answers won't just have 2 or 3 different factors, but they'll be able to link them together and say this one must be the most important because it's caused this or it's caused this. Okay, I will come back to here. I wish you the best of luck with preparing for your exams. Please watch over our videos. Don't let this be the only thing you do. Look at flashcards, look at revision guides, but make sure you have the full story and the full understanding of what caused World War One, what happened during the key battles and why it became a stalemate, and how that stalemate was broken with technology and new tactics. And then finally, why is it that Germany lost? Was it the naval blockade, or was it other factors like America joining the war? Best of luck. Bye-bye.